Chapter 331. Maisie had been under the impression that the things that happened to Layla would tone Willow down, but it seemed to Maisie that it was not the case. It had only been half a month, and Willow had started again. Maisie frowned and said, "I'm sure that Willow wouldn't stop so soon. Uncle Kennedy, can you tell Angela to keep an eye on those two kids?" The only thing she was worried about right now was the two kids. Kennedy nodded. Maisie sat in her office and thought for a moment. Willow had said Nolan had sold her to the underground freeway. If that were the case, then how did she escape from a place like the underground freeway? Maisie figured that if she wanted to know the answer, she needed to look for Nolan. Maisie came to the administrative office. She rapped on the door a few times, but nobody responded. It was only when he decided to go in that Rowena's voice rang out behind her. "Nolan is talking to his client about a project downstairs. Why are you looking for him?" Maisie turned her head around and offered her a smile. "I'm here to invite my fiancé for lunch, of course." "Well, since he's busy, I'll go back to my office and wait for him." Just when she was about to leave, Rowena grabbed her arm. "Ms. Vanderbilt, can I have a second with you?" Maisie looked at the hand that was grabbing her arm and said, "Sure." Rowena released her hand and met her gaze. "Don't you want to know what happened between the Goldmans and the de Armas?" Both of them then headed to the stairwell through the emergency exit. Standing with her arms crossed in front of her chest, Maisie asked, "What is the thing that you want to tell me?" There was no expression on Rowena's face. She said, "The reason Grandpa loathes the de Arma family is that the de Arma family has allied with those hypocritical people from the Royal Left-Wing Party. Rather than saying that the Goldmans hate the people from the de Arma family, it would be better to say that the Goldmans have never had any good feelings toward the de Arma family either. These two families are destined to be enemies." Maisie lowered her head and replied, "So what has it got to do with me?" Rowena went closer to her and continued with a faint smile. "Stop saying that this has nothing to do with you, Maisie. Hernandez de Arma is your grandfather. And your grandfather is the main culprit who killed Nolan's mother." "What do you mean?" Maisie was stunned. "You didn't know about that? It seems like Nolan really didn't tell you." Maisie continued to stay in the stairwell even after Rowena had left. And her heart was sinking with each passing second. She knew Nolan's mother had been kidnapped and murdered, but she never expected that the culprit would be her grandfather. However, why didn't Nolan and Uncle Kennedy ever tell her about it even after finding out about her identity? Considering Rowena's personality, Maisie reckoned that she must be up to something no good for telling her everything. In any case, she had to at least listen to Nolan's explanation. Suddenly, her phone rang. She answered the call, and her expression changed. She didn't even return to her office and rushed out. In the hospital. The doctor was coming out of the ward when Maisie arrived. She walked up to him and asked, "Doctor, how is my father doing?" "You're Stephen Vanderbilt's family member?" "Yes, I am," Maisie replied. The doctor took a look at the medical report and replied, "The patient is doing fine right now, but since he received a heavy blow to the cervical spine in his back, he needs to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation." After the doctor left, Maisie pushed the door open and entered the ward. Stephen was lying on the bed, and he looked haggard. She approached him and asked, "How do you feel, Dad?" Stephen looked at her and smiled. "I'm fine." She asked worriedly, "What happened?" After all, he had received a heavy blow to the cervical spine of the back, and it was clear that someone had attacked him. Stephen was stunned. The light in his eyes dimmed, and it seemed like he did not want to talk about this. Maisie grew a little impatient and said, "Dad, how long are you going to keep this from me?" Chapter 332. Nolan's grandfather didn't approve of you being together, did he? Maisie was stunned and lowered her head. Stephen understood everything when he saw her reaction. "It's because your mother is from the de Arma family, and the Goldmans hate the people from the de Arma family. Right? Dad, who told you that? Stephen paused for a moment before saying slowly, it's Nolan's grandfather. He asked me to tell you to stay away from Nolan. He told me that bad things will happen to Nolan if you'll remain by his side. After that, when I sent them away, I was beaten by a masked man in front of the door. That guy threatened me that if you don't leave Mr. Goldmans, he would. Stephen stopped as he did not want to continue anymore. Honestly, he did not want to force his daughter to leave Nolan because of this matter. Maisie set her jaw tightly. She fell silent for a short moment and then rose to her feet. Dad, get some rest. I'll see you tonight. After that, she left the ward with a stern face. When she was back to Seoul, she summoned Kennedy to her office. She turned around to look at him and said calmly, I plan to merge Vena in the near future and relocate our studio there. Kennedy was dumbfounded. In the near future? What do you mean by in the near future? And why do you want to relocate our studio there? Maisie's eyelashes quivered. But she continued sternly. Nothing. My dad left Vena in my hands, so I can't let him down. She subconsciously clenched her fist tightly. Her kids had been attacked on the internet, while an unknown person had ambushed her father. This series of events proved to be too much for her to handle and weighed her down a bit, especially what had happened to her father. She had been there that day when Titus had called Nolan. It was just that she did not expect him to do such a thing in order to force her to leave Nolan. In the administrative office. She wants to relocate Seoul to Vena? Nolan was a little bit stunned when he received the news from Kennedy. Kennedy was just there to tell Nolan about Maisie's decision. He nodded and added, exactly. I think Z probably wants to expand the studio. Besides, Vena is basically half closed. Nolan pressed his lips into a fine line. If Maisie wanted to move Seoul to Vena, then why didn't she tell him personally? After Kennedy left his office, Rowena came in. Nolan. She had heard the conversation between Kennedy and Nolan. It seemed to her that Willow had done her job well after receiving money from her. At present, she was confident that that bitch Maisie would think that Titus had threatened her father. Humph. Once she moves her studio out of here, without Nolan watching over her, I'll have more than one way to get rid of her. Nolan, Eastham Incorporated has invited us to a banquet this evening. Grandpa wants me to attend with you. I'm not going, Nolan replied without any hesitation. Rowena smiled and said, Grandpa said that the current CEO of Eastern Incorporated was Madame Goldman's manager. Nolan fell silent. In the evening, Maisie brought the 3 kids to the hospital. Since they were here to visit their grandfather, all of them brought a lot of fruits and snacks with them. When Stephen saw how caring they were, he smiled. I'm already very happy that you 3 have come to visit me. You can keep the snacks for yourself. Daisy walked up to Stephen and asked, Grandpa, since you're in the hospital now, what about Reddy? Is there anyone to feed it? Will it get hungry? After all, hunger was unbearable. Stephen patted her head and replied, Don't worry. There's an automatic feeding machine, so it won't get hungry for 2 days. Ready? Maisie asked, confusion thick in her voice. Daisy replied with a smile, her eyes bright like stars in the sky, It's a dog that Grandpa keeps. Its name is Reddy, and it's cute. Chapter 333. Maisie broke into a smile. When she had been in the training camp, Nolan would bring the 3 Rugrats to visit Stephen from time to time. To her surprise, they got along well with their grandfather, and they even had pets. The 3 of them were playing at the side. Stephen looked at Maisie, who was sitting silently at the side of the bed and said, Z, don't think too much about me. If you and Mr. Goldman really love each other, I won't break you up. Maisie licked her lips, lowered her head, and said, Don't worry about me, Dad. Oh yeah. I plan to merge my Seoul Jewelry Studio and Vena Jewelry into Seoul Jewelry. What do you think? Stephen was dumbstruck for a moment when he realized that Maisie was asking for his opinion. He paused for a moment before saying, I'm going to leave it for you to decide. Venna is a legacy from your mother. I gave it to you, so you can do whatever you want with it. After spending some time with her father, Maisie brought her kids back to the villa at Blue Bay. Colton went closer to Maisie when they were having dinner and asked, Mommy, is Daddy not coming back for dinner today? Daisy chimed in, Daddy didn't come back for dinner yesterday either. Maisie just lifted her eyelids and replied, your daddy is busy with his work. You've got to understand him. The three Rugrats did not say anything anymore. At night, Maisie sat at the side of the bed and read them bedtime stories. After the three of them had fallen asleep, Maisie closed the book and put it back on the table. She tucked in the corner of the cover for them and turned off the light when she went out. She did not go to bed after taking her bath. Instead, she stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. She stared into the distance and sank into her thoughts. A pair of arms wrapped around her waist and pulled her closer to a warm object. The familiar deep voice rang out above her. Why haven't you slept yet? Maisie was stunned, but she did not say anything in return. Z? When Nolan did not receive any response from her, he lowered his head and buried it into her fair-skinned neck. Maisie shrunk her neck as if she was trying to avoid him. And then she caught a faint whiff of alcohol from his body. Have you been drinking? Nolan chuckled and replied, yeah. The CEO from Eastham Incorporated invited me to dinner today. I met an acquaintance, and we had a few more drinks. Z. Why do you suddenly want to move your studio? Nolan asked. He put his hands on her waist. Her waist was so small that he could hold it with one hand. Maisie kept her head low. She opened her mouth but did not answer the question. Instead, she pushed him away and said, It's getting late. Let's go to bed. Z. Nolan grabbed her tiny waist and coiled his arms around her waist. What happened? He could see that something was wrong with Maisie today. Maisie replied flatly, nothing. Don't lie to me, Nolan said, frowning. He was not blind. Nor was he stupid. He could tell from her expression and reaction that she was obviously distraught. It was only then Maisie slowly raised her head and looked into his deep eyes. Nolan, if I told you that the reason my father was hospitalized is that your grandfather wanted to break us up, and he got beaten up because of that, would you believe me? Nolan's face sank. After a short while, he said softly, Z, I know my grandfather has a bad temper, but he would never lay his hands on innocent people. Yeah, you're right. I don't want to believe it either. If I'm Elder Master Goldman's target, he can come at me, so why must he drag the innocent into this? Maisie shrugged his hand off and said indifferently, I know your grandfather refuses to accept me, but I don't want my father to get injured because of me again. Therefore, let's separate for a while. After saying everything in her mind, she did not look at Nolan anymore and lay down on the bed. Chapter 334. Nolan was frozen on the spot, and his face was turning grimmer and grimmer with each passing second. The next day, at the Goldman mansion, Nolan stepped into the living room. When he saw Titus was reading a newspaper on the couch, he walked up to him and asked, Did you go to see Z's father? Titus harumphed coldly when he realized that Nolan came back because of this. I just went to talk to him. Why? Did she complain to you? So you sent someone after her father? Sent someone after her father? Titus put the newspaper down and asked, What do you mean? He had just informed Stephen of the consequences if his daughter refused to leave his grandson. After all, he needed to rule out any possible danger. He had not sent anyone after him. After you went to look for Stephen yesterday, he was beaten by someone, and he has been hospitalized since then. Was that not you? Nolan asked, his face grim. Titus was stunned. Someone beat Stephen. And he has been hospitalized? How dare they set me up? Titus thought angrily. No, it's not me. Do you honestly think it's me? If I really wanted to beat him up, I would do it openly and squarely. I would never resort to such a despicable tactic. It occurred to him that the Vanderbilts were no good. They had deliberately set him up so that his grandson would suspect him. This is so frustrating. Nolan chose to believe his grandfather in the end. After all, he wouldn't do something like that. However, if it weren't his grandfather, then who could it be? At Soul Jewelry Studio. By the time Maisie stepped into her office, Nolan had been waiting for her on the couch. She was dumbfounded for a while. But she soon came around to her senses and peeled her gaze away from him. What are you doing here? Slowly, ever slowly, Nolan rose to his feet and approached her. I've asked my grandfather. It isn't him. Maisie did not reply. Nolan grabbed her arms with both hands and pressed on. You don't believe me? I believe you, Maisie replied, but she did not look him in the eyes. But it doesn't mean anything. She animatronically lifted her head and looked at him like a marionette attached to strings. However, there was no emotion in the depth of her eyes. Maybe you should listen to your grandfather. Maisie Vanderbilt. Nolan snarled, his voice thick with anger. He would call her by her full name only when he was angry. He couldn't stand her indifferent attitude anymore and said, I've already told you before. Even if my grandfather doesn't agree with us being together, I'll not give up on you. I'll look into this matter. Aren't the people from the De Arma family the ones responsible for your mother's death? Nolan was stunned when he heard what Maisie said. The expression on his face right now proved that everything Rowena had told her was the truth. Nolan, maybe your grandfather is right. We shouldn't shut up. Nolan growled as he grabbed her into his embrace. Without my permission. I won't allow you to leave my side. When the person in his arms did not give him any response, it was only then he realized he might have allowed his anger to get the best of him and startled her. He lowered his voice and said, Believe me. He cupped her cheeks with his hands and lifted her head. He looked at her intently with his deep amber eyes and continued. The De Arma family is different from you. The reason I didn't tell you is that I was worried about the impact it would have on you. Maisie looked into his eyes. She set her jaw tightly and didn't say anything. Nolan lowered his head and pressed his forehead against hers. With their warm breath intertwined together in the tiny space between them, he pitched his voice low and said gently, Believe me for once. Maisie had to admit that she began to waver. Perhaps just like Uncle Kennedy had once told her, she needed to follow her heart. Her eyelashes quivered, and she answered, Okay. I believe in you. Chapter 335. The smile in Nolan's eyes deepened when he heard that she was willing to believe in him. He leaned forward in an attempt to plant his lips on hers. Suddenly, something popped into Maisie's head, and she raised her hand to stop him. Nolan narrowed his eyes when his wife did not allow him to kiss her. Did you have anything to do with Willow in the underground freeway? Frowning, Nolan grabbed her hand and replied, She asked for it. If not, I wouldn't have thrown her to the underground freeway. Why do you ask? Maisie pressed her lips thin and replied, Do you still remember that Waylon and Daisy were attacked on the internet? She's the main culprit. Did you go to the underground freeway? Nolan's face sank. How dare she go to a dangerous place like that alone? What if something happened to her? Maisie lifted her brows and replied, She isn't in the underground freeway anymore. Nolan was slightly stunned. He parted his thin lips and asked, Did she escape? Exactly. I asked Uncle Kennedy to help me look up the IP addresses of those internet trolls. I approached them one by one, and that's how I found out that Willow was the mastermind. When I was talking to her, I suspected that someone was helping her from the back again. Nolan secured her in his arms, lowered his head to look at her, and said, So you'd rather get help from another man than me? Honestly, she did not know why either. Whenever she came across a problem, she would never seek help from Nolan. I'm your husband. And I'll support you no matter what happens, he said as he kissed the back of her hand. I just wish that you could rely on me a little more too. Maisie stretched her arms and coiled around his neck, seizing the opportunity while he was stunned. She stood on the tips of her toes and kissed him. Her face flushed slightly after what she did. I will. I promise you. The gentleness on Nolan's face froze at the bottom of his eyes. He grabbed the back of her head and planted a deep kiss on her lips. I just can't get enough of hers. Rowena was standing outside the door with her back against the wall. She had come to look for Nolan, but she did not expect to run into something like this. She bit her lips and thought, Willow was exposed so soon? Humph. What a useless woman. Since Maisie had not taken those words seriously, Rowena only needed to give her a little push. Even though cyberbullying was not a good thing, both Waylon and Daisy had benefited from it. Not only could they star in the same show with Helios, the best actor, but it was also revealed they were Mr. Goldman's kids. Therefore, after the cyberbullying incident, both of them became extremely popular. A lot of movie directors and kid commercials approached them, offering them plenty of opportunities. If the assistant hadn't rejected some of them on the grounds that they were too young to take on so much, they would have had a lot of work to do. Daisy and Waylon were sitting inside the dressing room to get their makeup done. They were going to shoot a commercial about the Gemini reading machine. And they were reading the scripts that were prepared for them. After their makeup was done, both of them walked into the photo studio under the escort of Angela and 2 bodyguards to start shooting when Daisy passed through a collection of equipment. A very heavy piece of lighting equipment suddenly fell on her. Daisy. Angela hastily pulled Daisy away, and the lightning equipment landed on the ground with a loud bang and crushed her foot. Daisy was startled. She tried to help Angela, but the bodyguards pulled her to their back. Hurry up and save her. All the available crew members on the scene rushed forward and lifted the lighting equipment. Angela's foot was fractured, and her face turned pale in pain. When she saw Daisy was fine, she forced a smile onto her face and said, "Don't worry about it." However, she passed out before she could finish her sentence. Waylon took advantage of the chaos and went behind the equipment by himself. Soon, he found something fishy on the ground where the lighting equipment had been set up. Emperor Entertainment Incorporated. You guys are there to shoot a commercial. How could something like that happen? Who is going to be responsible if something happens to those 2 kids? Chapter 336. Morgan picked up the call from Gemini Advertising Incorporated and said with an exasperated tone, "You better find out who's in charge of the equipment, or else, don't blame us." He then hung up the phone. He had already understood the situation. Angela had been injured and was admitted to the hospital. It was fortunate that the 2 children were fine. Helios appeared outside the office and seemed to have heard the conversation from just now. His brows were furrowed as he opened his lips. What about the 2 kids? They're by Angela's side in the hospital. Helios turned around and left as soon as Morgan said that. At the hospital, the 2 Rugrats stayed by Angela's side, accompanying her. Daisy still had lingering fears and turned to look at Waylon. Waylon. Will Angela be okay? Waylon comforted her. Don't worry, Angela will be fine. His tiny brows creased after saying that. According to the traces found at the scene, it's obvious that someone was targeting us. Helios appeared outside the ward with a bodyguard. Daisy came to him after seeing him. The girl who would usually laugh when she saw him seemed distressed. Uncle Helios, are we in any trouble? Daisy had been under the impression that she was in trouble because she had caused Angela to get hurt. Helios rubbed her head and comforted her. No, it was just an accident. It was not an accident, Waylon retorted. He then explained in his slightly childlike and calm tone right in front of Helios's surprised gaze. Someone created this accident deliberately. It's Daisy who would have gotten hurt if Angela didn't push her away. Oh, it might be the both of us. Waylon's words astounded Helios. The way Helios glanced at the little boy became a little more solemn and critical. How can a 5-year-old child be so mature? Helios squinted. How would you know that it's not an accident? I went to investigate the site and found out that a comber of the tripod used to hold the device has been sawed by someone. The incision looks flat, and it was sawed diagonally. Waylon propped his small hand against his chin and added, if I'm not mistaken, if that thing could last until the time we got on stage, it would mean that someone was in the equipment backstage at that time. Helios walked up to him, raised his hand, and rubbed his tiny head. You're very good at analyzing at such a young age. Waylon thought he did not believe in him, so he stopped talking. Helios received a call at this exact time, and it was about Gemini Advertising Incorporated's investigation result. According to the company, Waylon's analysis of the cut found on the device was exactly correct. At Black Gold Group. Have you found out who's the person behind the scheme? Nolan stood in front of the French window while answering the phone. The person on the other end of the phone call said something to him, and his facial expression turned gloomy gradually. He then said coldly, tell the people at Gemini Advertising Incorporated that I'll only give them 3 days. Their only way out of this incident is bankruptcy if I don't get any update from them 3 days later. He put the cell phone down. How dare you make a move on my son and daughter? Something flashed across Nolan's mind, and his gaze intensified a little. He had already noticed that the things that had been happening in the past few days were a bit strange, including the training camp incident. Maisie was bitten by a venomous snake in the training camp, Winona died all of a sudden in the interrogation room, and Grandpa knows that Maisie is related to the de Armas too. Everything happened altogether so coincidentally as if someone is cooking up a scheme behind the scenes. What's more, my 2 kids were first abused on the internet, then Stephen was threatened and got hospitalized because of that, and the children were almost involved in this accident. Chapter 337. All these hidden dangers seem to revolve around one person, Maisie. It's as if these incidents were all directed at her. Nolan called Quincy again on his cell phone. Get your ass back here. Quincy froze. But Elder Master Goldman said. Nolan's gaze turned gloomy. He won't know a thing. I need you to come back and investigate something. It was only after reading the news update that Maisie learned that Waylon and Daisy had run into an accident when they were filming a commercial. She had been supervising the renovation at Vena. So she rushed to the hospital from the company. Seeing that the 2 children were staying in the ward with Helios, she was slightly relieved. Mommy. Daisy dashed and hugged her. Maisie saw that her eyes were bloodshot as if she had cried and felt tormented. Daisy. Did you and Waylon get frightened? It was Angela who saved me. Daisy pouted after she finished speaking. Did I hurt Angela? Maisie stopped talking for a split second as her gaze landed on the unconscious person lying on the hospital bed. Angela had saved her kids. And Maisie was very grateful. I must thank her in person when she regains consciousness. Silly girl, if Angela is willing to save you, all you need to do is to remember the kindness that she's shown you and repay it when you're all grown up. Maisie then held Daisy's hand, walked to Waylon's side, and said to Helios, Mr. Boucher, thank you for taking care of these 2 kids for me. Helios chuckled, it's okay. These 2 children have been targeted, and I couldn't be at ease to leave them to themselves in this ward. They've been targeted? Could it be that the accident that happened during the commercial shooting wasn't an accident? Helios took a glance at Waylon. This boy has quite a keen mind and noticed that the equipment on the set had been tampered with. Gemini Advertising Incorporated has also provided me with the investigation results. Maisie's face turned sullen. So it's really not an accident. Someone did it on purpose. It seems that they're targeting my children, but I'm their actual target. This incident resembles Dad's assault incident. However, even if Elder Master Goldman wants to force me to break up with Nolan, there's no reason for him to do such a thing to the kids. Could it be Willow again? Maisie and Helios came out of the ward with the children and happened to run into Titus and Rowena, who had come to the hospital. She guessed that Titus should have seen the news too. Titus' face looked a little upset when he saw that she had brought her kids along with the child of the Bouchers. He even reprimanded Maisie as soon as he opened his mouth. I don't know how you, as a mother, think when it comes to this matter. You actually let your children get into an industry like showbiz and almost caused them to be exposed to such an accident. Maisie did not speak. I actually reflected on myself about the fact that I agreed to let them enter the entertainment industry. Rowena gave off a gentle smile. Grandpa. Don't say that. I can see that Ms. Vanderbilt is very distressed and cares for the children. If she really cared, she wouldn't have let her children enter the entertainment industry. As soon as Titus finished speaking, Waylon stood up with his small, sulky face. We entered the entertainment industry voluntarily. You have no right to rebuke our mommy. Titus was stunned for a moment. Seeing how Waylon protected his mother, the more the little boy resembled that brat, Nolan, who went against him in order to protect her. Maisie felt helpless and patted Waylon's shoulder. Waylon, you can't talk back to your great-grandfather like this. Humph, I can live without my great-grandfather, but I can't live without mommy. Waylon sounded resolute and even glared at Rowena when he said that. Although he was young, he could tell deep down what was more important in life. No one could replace his mother's place in his heart. Chapter 338. Seeing that the kid had the guts to glare at her, Rowena tightened the fist that was placed behind her back. She looked in the direction of the old man as if she was hoping that he could show his support toward her. Although Titus' expression did not look too gleeful, he did not lose his head because the boy talked back to him after all. Helios could already see Titus' dissatisfaction with Maisie in just a few minutes. There was a faint smile hanging on his lips. I can understand why Elder Master Goldman doesn't like the entertainment industry. But since these two children have made this decision, you can't just deem that the choice they made was based on the instigation of others. The children have their own thoughts too, don't they? A gleam of slyness flashed across Rowena's eyes upon seeing that Helios was speaking up for Maisie. This woman is really capable. Not only has she hooked up with Nolan, but she also has quite a good relationship with Helios. She smirked and asked, Mr. Boucher, since when did you become so close with Ms. Vanderbilt? Titus was already dissatisfied with the gossip about Maisie and Helios that had appeared before this. She's given birth to multiple children with Nolan but still doesn't know how to avoid suspicion. Thus, his expression became even worse now that Rowena had asked the question. Helios answered before Maisie could even speak, what does it matter whether we're familiar with each other or not? He explained slowly, I grew up with Nolan, and I like these two kids very much. As for Ms. Vanderbilt, she's very talented and a woman worthy of admiration. However, I still have a great sense of propriety when I'm around my friend's wife. The smile on Rowena's lips narrowed slightly, but she did not speak. It felt like Helios' words were implying something else. Is he reminding me that I have no sense of propriety? Seeing that the two children were safe and sound, Titus felt relieved and did not want to say anything more so that a certain woman would not go to her grandson to badmouth him. Let's go back. Titus turned his head and said to Rowena. They then left together. Rowena took a glance at them before catching up to Titus. Maisie's eyelashes twitched as the old man's misunderstanding of her was growing deeper and deeper. She turned to look at Helios. Mr. Boucher, thank you. Helios smiled and nodded. You're welcome. I just said what I should say. Daisy tugged at Helios' sleeve. Uncle Helios. Does our great-grandfather dislike the entertainment industry? Waylon wrapped his arms. It doesn't matter if he likes it or not. Helios' eyes turned a little gloomy as he looked at the little boy standing beside him. Yes. Because your grandma was from the entertainment industry too. Maisie was astounded. It was said that Helios and Nolan had grown up together, but they did not seem to interact with each other too much. Mr. Boucher, do you know Nolan's mother? Helios was startled for a moment before he said. She was a very good artist and a great actress by nature. Maisie stared at him. When Helios mentioned Nolan's mother, a hint of genuine admiration and respect was beaming in his eyes. Could it be? Is Nolan's mother Helios' idol? She seemed to have discovered the eighth wonder of the world. It turns out that the big gun in the entertainment industry has an idol of his own too. In the night, at the Blue Bay Villa, the three Rugrats, who had been brought over to the villa, were so delighted they could be with their parents again that they were enjoying their meal. Meals cooked by Mommy are still the best. Colton and Daisy, who were still chewing the food in their mouths, let out a satisfied voice. Nolan stared at the three rascals sitting next to Maisie with his arms crossed. These three Rugrats always occupied his wife as soon as they came over. Chapter 339. Maisie glanced at Nolan, who had been left out on the opposite side of the dining table and looked all sullen and jealous. She kindly fetched a piece of meat and placed it on his plate. Good boy, we still love you. Nolan was rendered speechless. This sounds inexplicably familiar. Daisy scooped a large spoonful of mashed potatoes and looked at Nolan with her glowing eyes. Daddy, Uncle Helios said today that Grandma is also from the entertainment industry. Why haven't we met Grandma? Daisy had just finished asking. And the atmosphere at the dinner table became a little strange all of a sudden. Maisie lowered her eyelids. He probably doesn't want to talk about his mother. But what she did not expect was that Nolan still answered Daisy's question, yes. But your grandma is no longer here. The three Rugrats were dumbfounded. That could mean two things. One was that she was not staying here with them, and the other was that she was no longer with them in this world. Maisie was doing the dishes in the kitchen after dinner. She was in a trance, thinking about something, so a plate slid off her hand and fell to the floor as she was putting it away. When she squatted down to pick up the pieces, her finger was cut by one of the sharp fragments and soon started bleeding. Nolan, who heard the commotion in the kitchen, quickly put Daisy onto the couch, got up and dashed into the kitchen. Seeing that Maisie was squatting on the floor and seemed to have been cut, he frowned, stepped forward immediately, and helped her up. Are you an idiot? Let me take a look at the wound. It's just a small wound. Maisie wanted to withdraw her hand, but Nolan clenched it tightly. He then said with a domineering tone, don't move. Maisie was at a loss for words. Daddy. Here's the first aid kit. Waylon took the initiative to bring the first aid kit. Nolan raised his eyebrows, grabbed the first aid kit, and took out a bandage to wrap her small cut. The other two rascals stuck their heads out into the kitchen to peep. Daddy and Mommy's relationship looks really good. Maisie raised her eyes and looked at Nolan. She was peeking, to be precise. This man looks really attractive when he's all serious. Her feet left the ground all of a sudden. When she returned to her senses, she had already been picked up horizontally. Waylon, clear the scene. Nolan left the kitchen with Maisie in his arms. Maisie was caught off guard as Waylon sighed, did not talk much, and silently picked up the broom to clean up the chaos. The other two Rugrats were rendered speechless. That's so sad. Back in the room, Maisie, who had just been put on the bed, thumped his shoulder. How can you let Waylon tidy up the mess? Okay. This fella is starting to use my son for such petty chores? You're worried that the kid can't figure it out by himself? Nolan raised his brows as the corners of his lips curved. He's smarter than you. Nolan, why are you so unsettled tonight? Is it because Daisy mentioned your mother-in-law just now? Maisie was flustered. Has Nolan really stopped treating me as a is what I said wrong? She murmured, we haven't even gotten married yet. Nolan approached her, squinted, and smiled. Are you saying that you want to marry me now? Maisie's cheeks were slightly flushed as she ducked back for a while. You can just talk from right there, There's no need to get so close up. Wait a minute, why am I feeling so happy? Z. Nolan's knees were already on the bed as he leaned over and trapped her in between his arms. Tomorrow is said to be an auspicious day. We should just get married tomorrow, Maisie responded instantly. Do you actually believe in the superstition of getting married on an auspicious day? Nolan said with a grin, it's February 14th tomorrow, Valentine's Day. Maisie's heart was on fire, and it was racing. It was an indescribable feeling. Someone who's never looked forward to marriage, actually look forward to it all of a sudden now. Maybe it's because of him. Chapter 340. But if we were to get married out of the blue, would your grandfather be pissed to death? Before Maisie could finish speaking, Nolan pushed her down and wrapped his big arm around her slender waist. His lips were concave upward and gave off a smile. So, we have to give him a fourth great-grandchild as soon as possible, preferably 3 more, so that the old man will be occupied with all the children and can't find fault with you. When the conversation was about to get a little more sentimental, she suddenly embraced him tightly. And this hug became the catalyst that crushed his rationality. The next morning, when Nolan woke up, he looked at the woman who was sleeping soundly in his arms and could not help but raise his hand and pinch her tiny nose. Baby, get up. His voice sounded melodious. And with the usage of baby, Maisie, who had awakened, could not even lose her head over his choice of words. No, I want to sleep for a little longer, she murmured. The gloom in Nolan's eyes vanished upon seeing her acting coquettishly in his arms. And the corners of his thin lips were lifted maliciously. Then I'll accompany you. Nolan pulled up the blanket. Maisie opened her eyes all of a sudden. Nolan gazed at her with his head resting on his palm. Maisie was flushed with anger. This bag is just trying to stall on purpose. Beg me. His smirk turned mischievous. Maisie bit her lip, turned over abruptly, and pressed him down against the bed. When they went downstairs, the 3 Rugrats were already sitting at the dining table for breakfast. Colton and Daisy were gobbling their respective sandwiches and sighed. Thank God that Waylon knows how to make breakfast, otherwise, we would have starved to death by the time Mommy and Daddy got up. Maisie glared at Nolan, who was walking beside her as if she was reprimanding him. This is all on you. The corners of Nolan's lips twitched as they were lifted, but he looked like he was enjoying the glare affectionately. I'm so sorry, we overslept and made you take charge again. Maisie rubbed Waylon's head. She had made the child bear a burden that should not be placed on his shoulders at this age. Waylon took a glance at the 2 idiots who were gobbling up the food next to him helplessly. Who made me the eldest among us? Nolan rubbed his head. Okay. Daddy is going to pick up our certificate with Mommy today. Colton tilted his head. What's the certificate for? Maisie pinched Nolan's arm. Nolan held her hand and chuckled. Your mommy is going to marry me, isn't that a good thing? Good, great. Daisy was exhilarated. Colton clapped his hands. That wicked woman has no chance now. Daisy stood up, stepped on the table with arms akimbo, and acted. If that ugly and wicked woman dares to snatch Mommy's man, we'll see how I teach her a lesson. Waylon hit the bowls and plates on the table with his silverware to accompany the mood of the ambience. Maisie was at a loss for words, while Nolan was rendered speechless. I really want to throw these rascals out. An extremely conspicuous Maybach stopped at the entrance of the city hall. Nolan and Maisie stepped out of the car and attracted everyone's attention instantly. Is that Mr. Goldman? My God, Mr. Goldman and his fiancée have come to obtain their marriage certificate. It's an honor to be able to get married on the same day with them. Maisie was a little overwhelmed when she noticed the attention they had gathered on themselves increased. Isn't the grandeur of this entrance a little too eye-catching? Can't we just come here in secret? But why am I using the phrase in secret? Nolan stretched out his long arms and embraced the person who was a few steps behind him, and the people around them were envious. Maisie looked around awkwardly and whispered, "Many people are watching. Let them be. We're about to become husband and wife. It's not against the rules for us to show off how in love we are." Nolan wrapped his arms around her waist and led her into the hall. One after the registration. Maisie stood stiffly and nervously with Nolan in front of the camera to take pictures.